Welcome to Ethics in Real Life, or Ethics IRL, if you will. I'm Eric Beerbaum. I serve as the director of the Edmund and Lilly Software Center for Ethics. And this event is part of our center's ongoing commitment to fostering thoughtful civil disagreement at Harvard and beyond in partnership with the FAS Civil Discourse Initiative. Tonight's event was inspired by Ethics in America, a public television series situated at the Harvard Law School from the late 1980s. And apparently a middle school me thought that this kind of gripping television, laying on each plot twist, and it attracted me like an episode of Lost. And like that show, Ethics IRL brings together a panel of individuals with diverse perspectives to address the ethical dilemmas posed by social media and online life. We'll present scenarios that could occur at any college campus and beyond, asking panelists not only to offer their expertise, but also to respond as individuals. Because ethical dilemmas don't come from theory entirely, they often hit you in everyday life. And IRL, yes, I learned recently, is a hashtag that we attach to this. That was a new learning on my part. As you listen, we encourage you to consider what you would do in these situations, and we will invite you to participate. Throughout the discussion, we'll ask for your input using the Slido platform. Please keep your phone ready to scan the QR code when they appear on the screen. We hope this evening marks the beginning of an ongoing IRL series, one that explores new topics and real-world challenges, always committed to presenting a range of viewpoints and fostering open, honest conversation about our most pressing issues. And now I'm honored to present our moderator, Nyin Hesse, the Kim B. Clark Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School and a faculty affiliate of the Center for Ethics, and our wonderful panelists. Rakesh Khurana is the Danoff Dean of Harvard College and Professor of Sociology and Leadership at the Harvard Business School. Soleil Golden is a Harvard undergraduate and digital influencer whose work centers on identity, justice, and mental health. Brody Douglas is a current undergraduate at the college and president of the Harvard College Union, a student organization focused on civil dialogue and debate. Yael Eisenstadt is the Director of Policy and Impact at Cybersecurity for Facebook, for Democracy, a former Facebook executive, and also a former intelligence officer and a White House advisor. Sul Chan is executive editor of the Columbia Journalism Review and previously served as editor-in-chief of the Texas Tribune. And I now hand it over to Nyin Ha.
AV team, yes? Okay, great, good. All right, thanks, good. So welcome, thank you very much. This is a great opportunity and honor to be here. And what we're gonna do tonight really is to try to, in some ways, ask the question, right? Has social media made the idea of free speech something that is in free fall? The question is, how do we sort of, on the one hand, try to preserve openness and free speech and dialogue, and at the same time then protect against harm, right, to people in that kind of context. And then I guess the last question for us is to ask, is it possible, bless you, what can we learn from the university environment in thinking about civil discourse more generally, not just at the university, but in the public more generally and in the social media space? And so for that, we couldn't have assembled a better group of panelists. And so I'd like you to imagine that we are in the context of a prestigious university. And as many universities have a course, the idea is in the course to encourage students to try to engage in open discussion. And so imagine that, like most universities, we have a course in what you might call sort of a distribution requirement space, a general education requirement space that's meant for non-specialists, right? But to help them to learn and think about moral reasoning, ethical analysis, by using contemporary issues in society. So that's the kind of course that we're talking about. And the subject for this week's course is immigration and the ethics of immigration around the world. And as part of this course, as is the case in many courses, students are asked, and not just asked, but required as part of their grade, to post reactions to the readings before class. And they're also required to post a response to what other students have written in response to the readings. Okay. And in the discussion board for the class, one student writes, I don't understand why people who want to defend their country are being called racist, are being called xenophobic nationalists. Since when did it become a crime to defend the borders of your country? In response to that, the second student posts, I don't see how you can live in a country where federal agents are ripping children from the arms of their parents and families. This is basically state-sanctioned trauma. Okay? So imagine those are the posts. And imagine now that you, in the audience, are a student in that class. And the question is, would you give your honest opinion, no matter what people might say, in response to those posts? Would you carefully craft a neutral position and try not to attract your classmates' attention? Would you reach out to the instructor and ask them to reconsider the assignment altogether, given where things might be going in class? And then finally, you would avoid posting anything and take the hit to my grade. So because there's sort of, imagine yourself as a student in this class, right? You've seen these two posts. One is sort of saying, look, what's wrong with being a xenophobic nationalist? The other one is sort of saying, look, this is basically state-sponsored trauma. How would you respond in that context on the discussion board? Great. Let's show the results. So you give an honest opinion no matter what people might say is sort of the clear winner, and then I would carefully craft a neutral response and try not to attract my classmates' attention. People reconsider. There we go, okay, good. So this is interesting. So most of you in the audience would say, look, I would give my honest opinion no matter what people might say. Brody, imagine you're a student in the class. Is that what you would do too?
Well, looking at this, I don't even know what to call a four-way dichotomy, but the first and second options both present their merits most of all, which I think is why most of the audience seem to lean towards there. But I don't think that those are the only choices in that scenario. You can certainly present your views regardless on which side they fall, in a way that isn't as inflammatory as the first few students had presented their views as, but is still stronger, still presents your views as they are. So in this case, I would try and present my views, which in this case aren't particularly strong, but still contribute to class discussion. Honestly, I wish something like this could happen in one of my classes, because as much as we all wish we're the ones who would go forth and boldly state our opinions, that's rarely us.
Well, it's rarely us, actually. So in some sense, you would rarely say your opinion. Is that correct? And why is that, Brody?
Because when you're looking at your grade, when you're looking at your classmates coming to this class every day and seeing your classmates' opinions, their judgments, it's difficult to go against the flow and have to face the consequence of that for at least the rest of the semester, if not the rest of your time at the college.
I see. So basically you sort of take a very neutral stance and actually not express your own views. Is that right? In this context,
I'm not saying that. I said on this particular issue, I don't have the strongest opinion, so they would come across as milquetoast. But were I to have stronger opinions, then I would try and state them in a way that's not inflammatory.
Okay, good. No, thanks so much. So, Leigh, do you agree, or would you handle it differently?
Well, I think that this prompt is missing a very important piece of context, and that is whether or not the responses posted are anonymous or they attach to the student's name who posts them. So first, before I answer, I'd like to clear that up.
So what difference would it make in this context for you?
I think it would make a pretty big difference, given that there are some classes that are smaller and more discussion based, and there's other classes that, like you said, general education classes that are much larger, and you can sort of get a feel for the different personalities in the room when the class is smaller. If you know the student's name who posted either comment on such opposite ends of the spectrum, that might change your views of that student, that might make you more inclined to want to associate with them or less inclined. If it's anonymous, I think that people would feel a lot more free in voicing their opinions.
Okay, but so the discussion board actually is not anonymous, so you have the names of the students, and so that would, I think, how would that affect you now?
I think if I'm speaking from the posture of myself, I really would not care whether or not people knew what I had to say, simply because of the fact that these people are not determining my grade in the class. And I think that I would rather voice my honest opinion for the sake of just feeling comfortable in my own, stance as a student in the class. I think as a Harvard student in particular, it inspires us to be who we are and actually to voice our opinions, even if they might be a little bit more, cut and dry, and some people are really not willing to shift on those opinions. But
so on one hand, Brody, you sort of say, look, you sort of be very moderate, try not to sort of necessarily express yourself in a way that might be controversial. I take it, but let me ask you this question now, Soleil. So if we go into the classroom and the instructor actually says, okay, I've pulled up these 2 comments from the discussion board, right, and actually engages the students on, well, what did you really mean, right, by posting that, is it a crime to sort of defend your country, right? And ask the other student, okay, so what do you think about this question of, is it really the case that, people are ripping babies from the arms of their families? And the professor actually goes into the classroom, right, with the expectation of wanting to sort of push the students on this, and does so as well. Does that change, Soleil, your desire to sort of engage directly on the issue now in the classroom live?
No, I'm a natural born debater. I love this kind of thing.
So you wouldn't feel that, and are you the average student?
How do you mean?
Well, we just heard from Brody that sort of a lot of students actually might not feel comfortable sort of being able to voice their concerns because of sort of the judgments that are being placed upon them by others and the concern for that semester. Is that right, Brody?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that if I were one of the students to have posted either of those comments, I would be the kind of student who's willing to defend my views.
Ah, good. Okay, so that's good. So you'd be willing to defend your views over
Yes.
there. But if you're a student who maybe disagreed with one of those students, you'd also feel comfortable sort of speaking up. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Brody, how about you? Still not so sure?
No, in fact, in this case, I think I'd be more inclined to speak out. There's something different about being in person. The boundaries caused by just discussion posts, where even if it's not anonymous, it's still estranging to just see a little name and some text, and you aren't able to communicate with people properly. And so I believe that in general, better dialogue happens when it's actually dialogue rather than just a series of discussion posts where words can be taken more easily out of context, where it can be harder to phrase exactly what you mean in a way that other people can, even if they disagree with, at least sympathize with.
So Rakesh, why is there so much concern then, just given what we've heard from Brody and Soleil about the mood in the classroom being difficult to have these sorts of discussions?
Well, first of all, I really appreciate hearing from the students. I think the challenge is that we actually did a survey of graduating seniors in 2023, and the results were the opposite, which is that we asked a question. So I took a prerogative as a dean and I dropped in 3 questions. One was, how comfortable are you speaking up about challenging subjects in the classroom? And 2/3 of the students said they were not comfortable, and only 1/3 said that they were comfortable. And I think in some ways there was a very much like what the student said is part of it, which is I think there's an aspirational self we all have. That we like to think of ourselves as the kind of person who would speak up when there's a challenging issue or something when it was especially close to our values. And then there's the actual person we are at the moment. And I think, part of what I would say is that, part of our opportunities, how do we get closer to our aspirational self? One of the things I love teaching at the business school is we teach a class on Martin Luther King, and, everybody in the class would have been in Selma. we have those moments sometimes in real life to see whether people speak up or not. And one of the things I think I've realized as a teacher is that you have to build the muscle to doing that. So part of it is, one is, do you start with the most difficult or challenging, polarizing issue, or do you slowly build capacity and build trust in the community among the students so that you can be hard on the problem and easy on each other? And I think that's part of, as an instructor, what I often realize is that this is a journey, and the instructor's role is to be part of that with the students and to establish that trust, because it's absolutely critical to the learning outcome. One vector I would add is, I think there's also assumptions sometimes students have what the progressive consensus might be, which is often, if I can say this point of view, I know that, like, I think quietly, I believe that 2/3 of the students will identify with it versus a third might not. And so that sort of calculus sometimes is factoring in as well.
So in this case, for example, the first comment, right, about sort of, what's wrong, since when is it a crime to sort of basically defend your borders, that one, if somebody basically is sympathetic to that, might be harder to speak up to in this case, whereas the other one wouldn't be. Is that the idea?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of a sense that, the Crimson does a poll. I love the Crimson's, but it's not a fully accurate poll, but it does suggest very strongly that a lot of students identify more on progressive elements, and others don't. And I think part of the challenge that we face in an environment is making sure that no matter which perspective you have, is that you're able to take different perspectives, and then at the same time develop an empathetic understanding. Doesn't mean you have to agree, and doesn't mean you have to change somebody's mind, but you should be understand both the strengths of your own argument and the weaknesses of your own argument and the strengths of the argument that you might be doing for it. I think I like what Brody's saying, is I think that was kind of what we're trying to get to at some level, and it's clear that we have a lot of work to do.
So in your situation, Rakesh, if you were the instructor in that class, how would you have engaged the student who basically made the first post?
It's a great question. I think, I would like to think that I would be in context with the student, and that, and it's hard to do, because, what are the other aspects? One of the things I try not to do is give the students a sense of what side of an issue I'm on. And I want it, because I think, one of the things that is that the ability to argue both sides, and I tend to do that is a kind of natural style. But I think it does, first, again, require building a sense of trust. And the last thing I'll say is, one of the first things I say to students on the first day of classes is that, like, we're in this together. I think I'm bringing something to the class because I've studied this stuff, but you're bringing a lot. I hope that over time we'll be in a position where we trust each other on each perspective. And I also want to tell you that I have a certain vantage point, which I know both gives me a way of looking at the world, but I'm also a tenured faculty member. I identify as male. I had these, which also means that there's certain ways I'm not seeing the world. So I hope that you'll trust when I make mistakes, that they're coming from a good intention, and please let me know.
Great. So suppose I'm the student who made that post.
Yeah.
Right? And you've decided to, so what would you say to me?
I'd say, so I'd love to hear a little bit of where you got that perspective, what informs it. And then in that kind of conversation, it said, if you had to argue against yourself, what would you do just to do that? And again, I think students actually enjoy that. If you had to argue against yourself, which is all that you're typically asking.
That would be a helpful point. You mentioned the Crimson. We're a prestigious university, not Harvard. So let's imagine it's a student newspaper. And the student who posted that remark about sort of basically what's wrong with it, is it a crime to sort of defend your country, right? After the class, or was very dissatisfied with that exchange. Okay, they felt that, look, yes, you try to be even-handed, yes, you try to sort of get argument itself, but at the end of the day, right, they sort of still very much hold on to this. And they felt that they really weren't actually, their view wasn't really recognized by their students precisely because of the point of this kind of broadly progressive consensus. So the student wants to publish an op-ed in the student paper, right, explaining their view, right, and defending their position, and explain how basically in class they felt that they were basically not really supported by their professor in this kind of even-handed sort of way. So Sewell, imagine that you are the editor of a student newspaper at prestigious university.
I was once.
Do you publish the op-ed? And as we asked Sewell whether I popped it, I'm going to ask all of you, if you were the editor, right, of the newspaper at prestigious university, would you publish an op-ed by this student?
Yes, so great question. The criteria for an op-ed, whether you're publishing it in the Harvard Crimson or in the New York Times, it includes usually originality, use of evidence to make a persuasive argument, newsworthiness, timeliness. There's a series of consideration that you consider. But one of the most important is there's a difference between an assertion and an argument. Now, I can make an assertion like my favorite color is blue. It's not that morally significant, so it doesn't matter that much. If I make a assertion like statement 1 or statement 2, that's a lot more complicated. So one of the things I'd point out, though, Nyenha, and I hope you don't mind my addressing this head on because I do this for a living, you have to, I've listened to variations of statement 1 and 2 constantly, having just led a newsroom in Texas. The key, I think, journalistically, is you have to listen non-judgmentally, but then you also don't just listen passively. You're not a stenographer. You got to ask, well, what do you mean by that? And so here's the question I'd ask to student 1 and student 2. To student 1, I'd ask a little bit more about, where your perspective's coming from. But I might ask, well, what are the limits of what you think the government can and should do to protect our borders? Now, here's what I'd ask student 2. Let's say most of us agree that family separations are morally reprehensible. Are there limits that you think the government can and should take to protect citizens, and what are our obligations to our citizens versus non-citizens? So for each student, I'm not saying you're an idiot, I'm not saying you're a bigot, I'm not saying anything, I'm not labeling, but I am trying to understand more of where you would extend that logic. And I think good opinion editors and good journalists, we're not here to argue with our sources, but we are here to understand the best faith argument and the most evidence and reasoned-based argument that they're trying to make.
By the way, in terms of your interaction with the students, given that you're no longer an editor of a newspaper, it sounds like you should be teaching students. Mm-hmm. But I guess you actually are now, right?
I teach journalism at Columbia.
Well, there we go. So see, it gets much better after leaving the Crimson. Okay, so that's helpful. But getting a point. So are there things that the student might say in the editorial that would sort of cause you not to publish it then?
Well, sure. I mean, first of all, unreasoned assertions is a big part of it. It has to have an evidence-based argument. Just to take an example, I'm a gay person. I once edited a very conservative politician making an argument against same-sex marriage. But his argument wasn't like God believes that marriage is between a man and a woman, which is a perfectly fine argument, but just not one that can be really reasoned through. His argument was really one about religious freedom in America and about how we balance the tenets of religious freedom against protection of individual rights. It wasn't an argument that I may have personally agreed with, but I helped him and his team get the argument to the most soundly logical and reasoned version of that argument that was possible, even though it's a view that I personally don't share. And that's kind of what I try to bring to my journalistic craft. Okay, good. That's helpful. So that's sort of the criteria and how you would think about sort of shaping an op-ed in that case. So we've heard, Yael, about how an op-ed might be shaped, what sort of could go into being published as an op-ed, what might not be published as an op-ed if it didn't sort of meet the criteria that Sewell laid out. We've heard from Brody in some sense that actually it might be easier to engage in class because you're sort of seeing a person face to face as opposed to sort of posting online anonymously. And Rakesh, you as an instructor want to try to bring out the best in students with regard to this. I guess, Yael, the question is, we've heard all of this in the context of the classroom. How would this have played out? Or could we imagine how it might have played out on social media in general?
Oh yeah, that would have been a much worse situation.
And help us understand what's so worse about it and why.
Sure. So what's interesting here is there's two quick reactions to actually in the classroom. If I were the professor giving that assignment, I would also want to first have a class on what are the boundaries of how we have these discussions. Because the problematic part to me was not either student's opinion, it was the way they wrote them. As someone who's published lots of op-eds as opposed to being the publisher, taking out the personal, how can anyone think this? Or you're crazy for feeling that way. And just saying, I believe X, Y, or Z because of X, Y, or Z. So first of all, I would have backed up and actually made ground rules to help people be able to have those conversations in a less personal way so that you could have debate.
Explicit norms.
Yeah. But now on social media, of course, this would have been a very different situation. You mentioned that you really prefer to have dialogue in person. You know, of course, I'm going to sound like an old person and I am an old person, because I also believe in dialogue face-to-face is always more productive than online. Doesn't mean that social media is not useful for all sorts of things, for ways to express yourself, for ways to engage. But social media is not constructive in a way to have deliberative debate, deliberative discussion. It is absolutely antithetical to the concept of active listening.
Yeah.
And you cannot debate a topic if you're not also able to listen. On social media, you are a speaker, or you are reading somebody's speech. There's not a tool to really help you listen and then engage. And so on social media, we all know the direction this would have gone. Either student, either side would have been jumped on by a whole army of people who disagree with them. It would have gotten very personal, especially if people are hiding behind anonymous accounts.
Are you saying the reply thread would not allow for the kind of deliberative discourse?
Probably not. And perhaps there would have been some grains of interesting conversation, but chances are in the way social media is constructed today, it would have been drowned out by the more emotional. And that is the difference between discussion face-to-face and discussion I don't want to treat all online platforms the same. I'm talking about algorithmically driven social media. It absolutely is meant to have an emotional reaction. That's what makes us engage, positive or negative. I think that dog's adorable. That's an emotional reaction. I want to engage with that account. But this is a charged topic that you propose here, and therefore it is likely to have gone in a very charged way online.
So part of what I'm hearing is that basically, so in the classroom setting, right, we could set norms. Right. We have face-to-face engagement. We're encouraging not just sort of speaking, but also active listening with the guidance of instructors to sort of help make that happen. Right. In the context of the school newspaper, or university newspaper, we have also, again, the idea of certain standards or norms with regard to what might get published or not. And I take it from you what you're saying, those standards don't necessarily exist in the online world. And there also isn't this concept of sort of active listening in this kind of way to sort of engage in a kind of collective discussion. So, can you share with us, for those of us who may not be familiar, an app called SideChat? And what is SideChat, and how does it work, and what do people do on SideChat?
SideChat is essentially, I'll actually quote Brody. Earlier, Brody said it's like Reddit, but worse. So it's essentially an anonymous app where people can post, primarily students. At other universities, it's called Yik Yak. Harvard, of course, has to have a different name for everything because we're incredible.
We're a prestigious university.
Yeah, but essentially you can go on there. Your username is unidentifiable. It's very hard to trace back side chats to an actual person, but sometimes people tell on themselves in different ways. But yeah, it's a place for, there's political discourse, social, and also just, people inciting arguments and adding fuel to
sorry to
fire.
ask, but do you have to have a Harvard? How do you know that it's another
Yeah, so basically, if it's through Harvard Key, like
Oh, so you do log in
yeah,
using,
you
okay.
have your Harvard. You have to have a Harvard email in order to be a student on SideChat.
But you also get to be anonymous.
Yeah, you also get to be anonymous. So
It's not a Harvard app. This is sort of a commercial app,
Got it.
right? That basically they're sort of using the fact that you sort of are, checking against your Harvard.
Yeah,
So on the
student
back
emails
end,
to it.
you're not anonymous. The person who is the administrator can actually know who you are. It's just you're posting anonymously.
True. I don't know who's behind the screen, but honestly, yeah, in order to be grouped together with other Harvard students, you have to have a Harvard email so they know that, you're a Harvard student.
And so how does it get used? Can you give us an example? Could it actually, in the context of the scenario we just described, would it be the case that maybe some of these comments that students made in class, would screenshots from the discussion board be posted on SideChat and sort of people continue the conversation that way?
Yeah, it's certainly possible. I think a lot of things that have occurred on SideChat have been really sort of knee-jerk reactions to things that have happened on campus. It's a place where people can vent their concerns and other people can come and agree with them. And it makes you feel really good about yourself when your post is upvoted 300 times. But also it's a place where people can say some really dark things and it's not publicly available who they are. And so it can be an issue.
So it's sounding more and more like the social media space that Yael just described, even in the context of the classroom.
Actually,
is that right?
even worse.
It sounds like a unique recipe for harm, though, because it's taking the intimacy and trust that should come from knowing that you're part of this academic community. And then, so in other words, it's even worse than regular social media. Regular social media could be like, that's some troll who lives halfway around the world.
Good.
But in a way, SideChat is almost, from what I'm hearing, I've never used it, is like saying these are definitely other Harvard affiliates because they had to be to log in, and yet they're saying anonymously hurtful or painful things.
Yeah.
So how important is this for your perspective, Rakesh? Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you all ban that?
No, we need it.
Well, also like banning. I'm one of these people who has a big aversion to banning anything because part of what we're trying to do is teach our students to move in the world. But it feels like there's a couple of different vectors here, right? So we've made a distinction between the context in which speech happens matters. So there's the kind of material, interactive world, and then there's the virtual world. And then the other thing is that part of what is that I think one of the primary changes that's happened with things like SideChat is what used to be a one-to-few or one-to-one has become a one-to-many, and then on the reverse, the troll many-to-one. So many people attacking a single individual. So that vector, I think, has also really changed. And I think the third one, I really appreciate what you just said, is that we try to create a community here. We surround ourselves with a college mission. We talk about educating citizen leaders in society. We think about bringing students from all different backgrounds and experiences, and we try to create in what sociology used to be a term called Gemeinschaft, a sense of a community, a sense of a village, a sense where people are held together by norms. And I think the thing about SideChat, which is so complicated, is it turns that community, which is binded together by norms, into a kind of invective or no lack of social responsibility. And so the lack of reciprocity, or that is really what throws off, because I think you think you're in community, you think you're in sort of Gemeinschaft world, but it turns out you're in this completely transactional, anonymous world. And I think that can be really, maybe we haven't developed as humans a way to hold both of those things together. And I think that's what's so distressing, which is the person next to me might have said something and I'm about to offer them a candy, and I normally wouldn't.
Yeah, you want to come back on this? Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to point out a few things from what I've been hearing. So actually my team at a former role I was in, we did a study for both SideChat and Yik Yak. Which is hard to study, of course, when it's an anonymous platform, so it ended up being more of a qualitative than a quantitative study. A few really important things. A lot of this gets unfortunately couched as therefore anonymity online should be banned, which is also really, really dangerous to have that be the answer. Because sometimes anonymity is protecting people, whether maybe it's a dissident somewhere in another country whose life would be at risk if they were to speak out. Maybe it's somebody who hasn't come out of the closet and doesn't want their parents to know who they are. Maybe there's so many reasons that anonymity is important online. The reason I asked about, but on the back end, it doesn't mean, therefore, it should be completely void of any responsibility. And so on the back end, it's not about not being able to be anonymous online, but you should have to prove who you are to be able to get onto the platform to begin with. If you do something illegal, you can't hide behind anonymity because on the back end, they know who you are. So that's a little technical, but two things I want to point out really quickly. One is, you mentioned something about the virtual world and then the real world and then classroom. And unfortunately, the virtual world does become the real world. And I think too many people like to talk about them as distinct because what happens online rarely stays online. Research after research has shown how many actual acts of violence or physical acts in the real world start online. So I want to be very clear. They're not necessarily separate. But the problem with a fully anonymous platform is, and when we did our research, we did find like horrific things happening on SideChat and on Yik Yak, and we did get in touch with the owners of both because we were a pretty well-known research team at the time. And they admit we don't do content moderation. We understand that when people are anonymous, they often bring their worst selves because they think there's no accountability for what they're saying. And we do have to grapple with, how do you have a platform like that, but also bake in? You can bake in basic rules and norms. You can bake in also things like you mentioned, which I'm curious about. I'd like to learn more from you. You mentioned that it feels really good. So is there an upvote process? Okay, so that in and of itself is the problem, right? Because it's not discourse if you're also being able to upvote or amplify or make something go viral, because then that is providing an incentive for the person to be more inflammatory so that they will get upvoted or amplified. So it's all in the design of the platform. There are much healthier ways it can be designed.
Good. No, so we'll get to some of this question about sort of the design of the platform, thinking about what the boundary is between the online world versus sort of the classroom. But I want to come back just really quickly, sort of, Sully, you mentioned that you need SideChat, so we shouldn't be banned. But
No, I'm against banning.
Okay. But Brody, in our earlier discussion, when I was talking to you, you actually said that you don't really use SideChat. So how is it that SideChat could be needed and necessary and something that's completely unneeded and unnecessary?
It's the kind of thing that certain people choose to integrate into their lives and others don't, and there are merits and harms to both. I rarely check Instagram as well. I'm just not that active on social media. A lot of people find social media, especially platforms like Instagram and SideChat, valuable ways of connecting with their communities. And I generally focus on certain in-person clubs or groups that I'm in, and that's just my social circle, and I don't really care what happens outside of it. That makes me insular, but at the same time, it gets a lot of drama out of my headspace. So I understand as somebody who wants to more publicly engage in the community at Harvard and around that it is necessary to see what other students are thinking, have that kind of barometer of attitudes, of environments. And a lot of my friends have found out important things on campus just through SideChat. Clubs value it as ways to spread their message or get people to come to events. So it has its place, but it's something that you can choose to avoid.
Sully, why do you need it?
Well, I think a lot of what we're hearing about social media, obviously I'm biased, but a lot of what we're hearing is these negative aspects about the anonymity and, comment threads and replies and things getting lost and overly emotional conversations. But what I would push back and say is that social media is a crash course in brevity. It requires you to become an individual who can distill their argument down to 150 characters, 1 minute in a video. And for me, that's something that took years to be able to do. And not everybody has the luxury or the time or even cares enough about actually getting their argument across in order to do that. But when you have engaged in a conversation, multiple people who have sort of hacked that ability, it can be a really great place for meaningful discussion. And with side chat, when you take away the tie to your identity, it gives you an opportunity to voice your concerns about real things that are happening on campus in the world. It's given students opportunities to organize and to voice their opinions in public ways. That's not to say that it hasn't had negative consequences. Bullying occurs on there, people get doxxed, all kinds of things. But it's also a really important, information vacuum for students to be able to share.
Okay, that's helpful, but I guess, so if you go back to earlier discussion about sort of active listening, what it means to engage in discourse, Rakesh, as an educator, how do you feel about the idea that basically we should be able to put our arguments into 150 words and a video?
I mean, I've never believed, to go earlier, I don't think a bumper sticker is an argument. So I think a slogan is not an argument. I think, though, and I would just respectfully challenge a little bit of what you said, and maybe this is, you're suggesting that, that somehow side chat is, whatever the person's basically making a decision about what to say in 150 characters or less. And then there's this process of upvoting or not upvoting, or I could also replace upvoting with some algorithm. There's like this third actor there, which we don't talk about, right? And the thing is, who put the constraints of 150 characters? That there's a algorithmic power underneath, which is maybe some version of upvoting, but it's actually aimed not toward enhancing or strengthening civic virtue or strengthening our democracy. It's aimed at profits. And that's what my colleague Shoshana Zuboff has pointed out, that the single defining characteristic of the internet, despite where it started, and I worked in the early internet company before I went to grad school, is that it has, what was supposed to be this thing about bringing a global village together has kind of metastasized into something very different than what its original intention was, which was partly defense, but also partly ways of like transferring large files across universities to each other. And I think we don't talk enough about this third actor, this intermediary, which is sitting there, and we're sort of thinking that somehow there's, the natural case of human beings is behind anonymous components, they will just sort of, say really nasty things or say really nice things. But there's somebody who's created a condition about certain kinds of comments and certain kinds of attitudes being elevated above other types of attitudes. And that interrogation, I think, is really important, because last thing I'll say is one thing we teach in the business school is that if it's free, you're the product.
So you want to respond quickly to what?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I completely agree with the constraints of any digital platform. When you sign up for that platform, you probably go through a whole terms and conditions that nobody actually reads. And in that it says, we use your data, we sell your data, we do this, we do that. And you agree to that, and you choose to engage in whatever platform because you see the benefits as a consumer. And, with cookies and everything, we know that we're the product. A lot of people don't think that deeply about it, but because of the way the world is so intricately connected nowadays due to, the spread of various apps and online platforms, people often see these apps as a necessity in order to remain engaged in global conversation. So they are willing to put aside that sort of discomfort with knowing that the third actor exists. The algorithm is pushing it out. There are people at higher levels making money off of this. But as someone who actively uses social media to voice my concerns and share opinions and share, things that are important in the world, I know that these things are going on, but I'm willing to put that sort of discomfort aside for the sake of using these platforms, because you can use them to your advantage and you can use them in a way that is socially meaningful.
Okay, no, thank you. So so it may not be a full-length argument, but there are ways in which to make it meaningful and support to use with full understanding of the situation. But I want to come back to sort of Yael's point about this distinction between sort of social media and the classroom. Right? As you mentioned, Soleil, people get doxxed. Things like this can basically spread very quickly outside the university, and that's exactly what's happened at prestigious university. So this exchange, screenshots from here, all the comments that students made on side chat sort of get screenshotted, they get sort of spread out into the rest of the world, along the lines you said, because basically nothing ever stays inside that space. Both of the students now are basically being doxxed, right? So their identities are made public on the internet. They're getting lots of hateful messages, both of them, from various sides of the political spectrum. And the university also is being accused in some sense of not protecting their students. And in fact, one of these students, right, has become so afraid, they've basically decided to withdraw from the university for the rest of the semester. And the parents basically decide to sue the university for not having taken ample care to protect their students.
Which student withdrew?
Sorry?
Which student was the
Does it
one that-
matter to you which student withdrew?
Yeah, it does matter.
Why?
It matters which student withdrew because it places sort of very important context behind the reasoning for the student to withdraw. So if their view, you know, what kind of hate are they receiving? What kind of, obviously it's bad from both sides, but I think it's important to understand what kind of criticism led the student to withdraw from the university.
And if I were to sort of imagine, I'm going to put this question to the rest of you, sort of how you think about that. In this situation, if we think about the first poster who sort of basically asked, is it a crime to sort of defend your country? And the second poster who sort of said, look, basically the federal agents are ripping children from their parents' families. Which one, if they withdrew, for your situation would make it harder for the university to defend?
Harder for the university to defend. The second student, the one who talked about.
Talk to us, sorry?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're shaking your head.
I mean, in either situation, I mean, we're missing a lot of details that I
Absolutely,
want to know
no, I
along
understand.
the way.
That's right, yeah.
So I would go back to the way the exercise was constructed to begin with by the professor. But the point of online mobs is not actually generally about expressing yourself or free expression. The point is to drive you out of the conversation. The point is to silence you. The point is to make you feel unsafe enough that you no longer want to express your opinions. And so part of my concern, because I could have absolutely seen that's where this was going to end up, is why I understand we are in a world where it makes sense for a professor to want to also help students understand how to interact online. It's an interesting and good exercise, but this is why there should have been constraints around it to begin with. I kind of want to go back to the 150 characters, but I won't if you need to move us along.
We'll come back to the 150 characters if you want, if that's okay. But I just want to sort of get this question on the table. So this does happen. This happened in the world. And so I think, Soleil, you're saying that for context, you want to know which the student was that was sort of, and how would that make a difference for you, I guess?
I mean, I sort of, as a student who's received countless emails from the university, different universities, sort of letting people know what's happening in a larger scheme of things, I think they would have a more, or did you say explain themselves or defend themselves?
Explain themselves in
Okay.
public court, that's right.
They'd have a more difficult time defending themselves in a situation where it seems like the second student is just responding to an initial inflammatory comment.
So that would make it, in that sense, then
that's more difficult.
More difficult to sort of defend that situation. Whereas you could imagine then the first student sort of withdrawing,
Who incited.
it sort of seems like that you can make sense
Exactly.
as well. Okay, good. So I guess I'm going to ask the audience the question then, of the various actors in the situation, who should be most responsible for the student feeling the need to withdraw? And so when we say the university, and that can include, in some sense, Yael, to your point, not just the institution of the university, but also the faculty member who's a part of the university in that kind of sense for not setting up guidelines for setting this kind of situation, not protecting the student. Is it the social media platforms that we've been talking about? Are they the ones because of this sort of third actor that's sort of behind there? Is it the student who posted online comments calling out the student, right? The students who basically took those screenshots from sort of side chat, Yik-Yak, and sort of posted them online? Or is the student for writing the op-ed and calling attention to themselves online? And so in this case, basically, Soleil, it goes back to your, that's the first student who sort of made that post. And so that's the question there. So that I think sort of goes along the lines of what you were saying earlier. So who's the most responsible in this situation?
great that personal responsibility is alive and well at Harvard.
What do you mean by that, Sewell?
To be less glib, I mean, obviously there's, in a situation like this, there's fault that could probably be attributed in a lot of directions. But at a certain point, I do believe that people have to be responsible for their own actions and their role in silencing or doxing or canceling others.
So in other words, in this case, students. Prakash, what's your thoughts on this?
I left one part out, of course. Under the federal law known as FERPA, the university has a lot of responsibilities for maintaining student privacy that would probably
complicate the situation.
Would probably have made the scenario in the first place a very tricky one.
Yeah, I mean, it is tricky. I mean, I think, I think we could all agree on a line is that nobody ever should feel threatened with violence, right?
That's right.
Like that's a clear line. And I think there's laws and a lot of things to back us up on that. I also think, though, part of the challenge here about assigning responsibility is, there's kind of an accretive set of structures that have kind of brought us to this moment. And when you were asking the question, I was trying to think that, part of it can't be just on having taken offense, because, the right not to be offended is not a real right. And a right in which offense is not allowed is not really a very worthwhile right? That it's not a great freedom. We'd be arguing over anything. I think that the thing that I keep coming back to in some ways is, how do we build capacity and tenacity in our community and build norms? Because the rules don't scale. And I really like, Yael, what you just said. And I think, everybody is kind of like, what is the version of norms that can exist in a world where the virtual and the real kind of intersperse? What are educational things that we could do, building those at a very young age for folks to become more digitally literate? And also, what regulations need to be put in place? Because norms are helped along with regulations. They sort of set some minimal conditions that would make it more likely that we produce the behaviors and the outcomes that we think are beneficial. And I feel like that we haven't had a conversation like that as a society. In fact, because it's 150 characters, a lot of entrenched actors. But I think, there's so much potential for achieving the benefits of the importance of anonymity, right? Because, governments have the monopoly on violence, and sometimes the only way to assert one's dignity and to assert one's voice is to be able to do it anonymously. And at the same time, one reason I became a social scientist, and particularly sociology, is I'm terrified of mobs. I am like, the mob is the scariest thing to me in the world. I think it's one of the most dangerous, which is a collective body that is the kind of outcome that produces lynchings and things like, nobody's responsible, but yet there was a whole set of conditions that were created, right? That you would often find, in fact, legally nobody was responsible in a lynching, but nobody ever talked about what were the social structures and conditions that created the conditions for that. And I feel like that's where there's a lot of opportunity for us to think about what was the role of each of these things in playing some participation. I don't know, maybe that's the right weighting.
Yeah.
You don't think that's the right weighting?
I don't know what the right weighting is.
Okay, good. Well, let's actually focus on one thing that you could comment on. I guess the question is, should the university hold the students who posted online comments calling out the students responsible? Does this university have jurisdiction in some sense about what students are posting? This is not on SciChat. This is not sort of talking about stuff in class. Do they let you do it?
There's a big difference between disagreeing with a comment online and trying to incite violence. And I think that this is a very difficult question to answer because we don't know where that line was in this situation.
Okay, good. That's great. So where would you draw the line? So at what point would we cross the line for holding students responsible for what they post online versus what we don't hold them responsible for what they post online? I guess. So how would we draw that line? I mean, Ruckus, how do we draw that line as a university?
I think it has to be the legal definition, almost direct, imminent.
It's a fact-specific, context-dependent analysis is the short answer. I mean, obviously, you cannot imminently incite violence. That's obviously illegal. But can I can I just make a point, because I don't want to discuss things too abstractly. We're in a really important moment right now where we have an administration that is saying that campuses are inhospitable to conservative students. I'm not saying, by the way, whether or not I agree with that assessment, but that is the reality that our universities are facing right now. So I want to just really, and almost provoke for a moment. I think personally, I'm tempted to say that the second student is more sympathetic. Like, let's say she's a student of color from an immigrant community herself, facing a lot of pressures from xenophobia. That's really serious. I also want to be provocative for a moment, though, that I think it would be extremely sad if the first student left. Because I'm going to be really frank. We live in a world in which 40% or more of the country not only agrees with student number one, but would say things much harsher. So if we can't come up with a reasonable answer to student number one, and if we're like so offended, I'm not saying anyone on this stage is, but if we're acting like we're so offended or bothered by student number one that we can't handle what they said, that should say something about us. Because I actually think there are, as I say this as a son of immigrants, and the first in my family born in America, the first to go to college, I think there are legitimate questions behind student number one. And what I'd rather do is like actually get to the heart of what student one and student two believe and where they're coming from and what they're trying to say, because I open the possibility that there actually might be more agreement between them than social media or this scenario would suggest.
Yeah, yes.
I was just going to say, I found it so interesting, your reasoning about the two students. I was really interested to hear your process there, because my political leanings and bias would also naturally say the first student was inciting, but was he? If the first student was just expressing their opinion, then that was not necessarily an incitement. One could argue the second student actually engaged in the incitement. So there's that. But also, again, this is impossible because there's so many actors here, but there are lines. There are many states in which doxing is actually illegal.
Of course.
I helped actually pass many laws in this country, many states, to make doxing illegal. So doxing's I don't even know if everyone here knows what doxing means. It doesn't just mean putting someone's name on the internet. You're putting personally identifiable information with the intent to cause harm, with the intent to send someone to that person's house.
Like swatting.
Yeah.
Right. So there are legal lines there. So if doxing was happening inside chat, once you're on Facebook, I don't think you can blame the university anymore. Mm-hmm. But if this is happening on side chat in the university as a result of this class, yes, the students engaged in whether it was doxing or whether it was calling for violence are absolutely first and foremost the ones responsible. But how the university handled that, I think, is also important.
Good. So what if we sort of pull back and sort of, it's not doxing, it's not calling incitement, it's actually not sort of basically calling up for violence, but it simply is basically lots of really negative comments about that person and sort of basically saying that, look, calling them names or things like that. How does that change the situation? Does that change the situation?
So you said the students' parents are suing the university. On what grounds? What are they saying to sue them?
Because the university is not protecting their child.
Yeah, so you should have put parents up there as the one of the other causes.
Well, I was going to put the professor also is not up there too, by the way. Right? Notice that. Yeah.
I know the statute of limitations. My mom said was 5 years after you're 18, but whatever. But I do think that part of and I do want to double click on what you said is that universities have a particular mission, right? Their mission is to sort of search for veritas as close as they can get it. They do that by bringing diverse perspectives and points of view to an environment. They create certain conditions that are different than free speech conditions, which is that you can say what you want to say, but you have to defend it with reason and evidence. I can stand outside and say the earth is flat. It's perfectly within my free speech rights. I can say it in the classroom, but don't expect it to get marked correct in my earth and planetary sciences class. Right. And so I think we also have to talk about the university as a context with a particular mission in society. And I think I'm really glad you brought up. It is under a great deal of strain right now, precisely because I think a large portion of our fellow citizenry believe that this was no longer a place where ideas could be debated or discussed, and that they had become taboo in a certain way. And then on the other side, largely a credentialing mechanism that's reproducing a kind of elite structure that is only creating greater inequalities and stratification. And the fact that many of our fellow citizenry believe that, we have to understand what the grain of truth is that has given rise to that perception. Now, I think universities are the greatest things human beings have ever created. My parents immigrated here. I immigrated as a I didn't get to choose. I was raised by my mother. Because of the education and what it represents. And I think somewhere along the line, parents think, oh, the purpose of the university is a validation of my parenting. Especially, you said a highly selective elite school, whatever. It's a way my child will get a job. It is a source of social mobility. It has all of these other functions, but it's not what its essential purpose is, which is to actually challenge each other's perspective. And the idea of identity abrasion, somebody used that word before, is a feature, not a defect of the system.
And speaking of, I really have to wonder what the original prompt for this discussion post was, because for the most part, when you get a kind of discussion post like this, it's expected that you'll post around 200 words, maybe more given the context, but actually have substantive arguments. I don't think any professor, any TF that I've ever had would actually give points to either of these students, because they aren't actually presenting any sort of information, any sort of insightful commentary on the original essay. They're basically just, as it's colloquially known on the internet, shitposting in the discussion. So
that's true, because you said that they were responses to readings, and there's literally no evidence that these responses came from readings. So both of these students would get
F's.
a 0.
No, grade inflation and A-.
Oh, yes. Back to my point that the professor set up a dangerous situation. The professor set up a situation where he or she was asking students to engage in the way that they engage on social media. And that is really, in my opinion, sort of antithetical to what you're supposed to be doing at a university. This is where I'm going to get my 150 character comment in. I totally understand that, listen, I am one of the people who, when Twitter started and you had your character count, I hated it because I had to learn how to make comments in a much more brief way, and there is a value there. But the biggest issue with that is it has pushed people more and more into taking absolutist stance, into being performative, and into not being able to say, I can see this, but I can also see that, and here's why. So I actually think the 150 or 120 or 240 character count is one of the biggest problems that we are facing today in deliberative discourse, especially, and I'm sure we'll talk about this at some point. You mentioned Shoshana Zuboff. I work with her. Like, this is my entire body of work, is the underpinnings of how these platforms work and the dangers. But the professor set this up, and I'm not saying the professor should therefore be able to be sued by the parents. Nobody misunderstand me for that. But the professor set up a situation to fail by asking students to post on an online forum short, pithy statements about homework. Well, was there a character count? Did he ask?
No. The professor's instructions were to basically post your reactions to the readings.
But that's my point, with no sort of.
No. The professor. What if the professor put rules in?
Guidelines.
Professor put guidelines in. The professor does put guidelines in, and do students always follow the guidelines that professors put up?
Nobody's gonna follow unless it's said that. Unless it's said that in order to get full points on this assignment, you must blah blah blah. If a professor is just going to say, write your response.
Exactly. Yeah.
Like you're saying, they're going to take the liberty of being able to say, well, this is the assignment and I have a chance to say what I believe. I think that something with these discussion boards, most of the time they're on Canvas and there is a character count. I think the professor themselves actually determines the character count. And a lot of my professors made these character counts shorter on purpose because they're trying to teach us concision and the ability to, like, for instance, you do debate. When I did debate, we have a limited amount of time to get our points across. That is extremely valuable. But also, like you're saying, when there is not a clearly thought out set of guidelines, students are going to do what their first sort of instincts tells them to do. And they say, I'm existing in a microbiome of information and social commentary and conversation. These people want me to share my views. And so they're going to share their views. And if they end up being punished because of it, not punished by the university, but punished inadvertently by others, by online bullying, et cetera, it's going to create a perception that, like you were saying, universities are no longer safe for certain people who hold certain viewpoints.
So I guess given the conversation that we've had then, what can the university do to help foster the kind of civic discourse that we're talking about? And then I will come to the question of what should the social media platforms be doing as well? And is this time to sort of have, because I think that is the question, right? We sort of have this ideal, the request is sort of put to us about what ideal conversation should be like, right? We've also had the conversation that, look, this kind of civil discourse that we're trying to engage in the context of the university is important not just for the university, but also for society at large if we want to try to address, right, the big challenges that we face and sort of engage in this kind of way, right? So I guess the question is, what can we learn from what can the university do, right, to help foster this kind of discourse for students actually not to have as their first response, I'm just going to basically sound off and sort of shitpost, as it were, but actually even if there aren't clear guidelines, right, to think about how would you engage in this kind of conversation, right? I think that's sort of what can the university do in this context? And then the question is, what can we learn, or is there anything to learn from the perspective of society more generally? I guess, Rakesh, starting with you, what should we do?
Well, I mean, I think first we have to just recognize that, the Speech Act, the Communication Act is kind of what makes us human, right? It is the thing that related to bonobos, like this is something that makes us human, and we should celebrate that like our ability to communicate with each other is really important. I think I would say that the thing that the universities have to do better is explain why communication and free expression and academic freedom is so important. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of students and faculty sometimes and others don't understand what is its purpose. I think we've heard a few things today that I think is really important. One is the ability to express oneself, anonymously or not, is an affirmation of dignity. The original form of oppression is when you can't share something about yourself or speak about yourself. In fact, you don't often even know who you are until you start speaking in some ways. It's often in some societies a sort of test of consciousness and conscientiousness. I think second is that it's the best way that we learn and get to the truth as best as we can understand it. That we each come in with biases or epistemic bubbles, to use that word, and the best way we can get, if the purpose of a university is a veritas kind of idea, the best way we get there is through this iterative method of challenge and debate, discussion, reason, evidence, and that our notions of the truth change over time, right? Like I used to think Pluto was a planet. That was something I was taught as a kid, and then I learned maybe not be a planet.
It's like learning that Hello Kitty is not a cat.
Right, but like that even things that we assume were facts actually turn out after reason and evidence to be something more complicated. I think the third is, and this is a more complicated way. It's how we learn to live with diversity. That actually understanding each other and hearing each other's perspectives is like a foundation for how we learn to live with diversity. Doesn't mean we have to celebrate it. As I'm enough of a social scientist to know that human beings like being around people who remind them of their favorite person themselves. But in a democratic, pluralistic society, without actually learning this, we actually are going to collapse as a society. This great experiment that drew my family. If not as a species. Yeah. This great experiment which drew my family here of what the United States is and the idea that people can be united by an idea rather than blood or some kind of, you have to have comfort. I think it's at stake, and universities, as part of the sort of social matrix of that, have to explain that to students.
But if 68% of students leaving basically feel like they actually can't express themselves in this kind of context that we're talking about, why is it so hard?
Because I think
why it's not working?
Because universities are doing something really difficult. Most of our students are coming from, we live in a highly stratified society. We live in places where socioeconomically, socially, racially, ethnically, religiously, increasingly politically, people are surrounded by people who are like themselves. And so what we are doing is that we're leaning into that. And institutions like many of ours, but especially I think places like ours, go through great efforts to bring that together. And I think we can't assume, because we are more diverse than we used to be, not everybody comes from, 50, 60 years ago. I know the proportions. More people came from upper private schools, a handful. There was a lot of what we would call social homophily. We're more heterogeneous because we've been more welcoming, et cetera. But that's also been part of universities right from the beginning. Like the universities used to debate, like, oh, could the Congregationalists get along with the Episcopalians? And then it was questions about people from the South and how would they feel in places like this. And then later it was like, what about Catholics? What about people who are Jewish? What if, how should we think about that? Then it was about, wait, maybe we should, 50% of humanity and gender, then different backgrounds. So I think we're part of an experiment. And we have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable with that. And I think we just haven't done a good job because there has been mission drift at explaining who we are and what we do, that we are the visible hand of democracy in certain ways.
So I want to come to you. I'm going to actually ask the students, Brody, how do you experience basically Rakesh's message? So yeah.
I want to add a couple things. I agree with everything Rakesh is saying. One reason I come back to Harvard is that I was a first generation low income kid, and I wasn't always that happy when I was a college student here. This was the 90s. It was just a different era. But as the years and decades have passed, I realized that all the gifts I got here, especially the gifts of the friendships and relationships and really diverse and incredible people that I met here. And that's one reason, along with my friendship with Eric Beerbaum, that I'm here, right? So I believe in the ideals. I also want to point out some realities. Fewer than about 40%, just under 40% of American adults have a four-year college degree. And the proportion of all college graduates who go to highly selective colleges is less than 2%. That doesn't mean highly selective colleges aren't important. They are important, but it also means that we have to think about what are the true engines of mobility in our society. That includes our state schools, which are terribly underfunded. It includes our 2-year and community colleges. And it does include a broader debate about whether every occupation should require a college degree, because our nation does have a lot of people right now with college degrees who are underemployed. And then you've got a lot of people, not just the Peter Thiels of the world, but others saying that you should be able to have a life of dignity in America working with your hands or working with your body. And it doesn't have to be that the only people who can succeed are people who are really good at computers or really good at sitting at a desk and reading a lot of complex documents, like probably all of us are. So there's this broader debate right now that I think is actually about the role of higher ed in our society. And I think that we have to keep it has to be an inclusive conversation. Yes. Frankly, 30 years ago, from Democrats and Republicans, the message was everyone's got to get a college degree. That's the only chance America is going to be competitive. Well, the reality is that 30 years later, it's still only about 40% of adults who have a 4-year college degree. So the answer can't be that you can't have a meaningful life without a 4-year college degree. Mm-hmm. Now, the second thing I think I don't blame the universities, it's a very nuanced argument here, but we have a major educational divide in our country. The last presidential election, in which it didn't really predict who you voted for, whether you had a college degree, was 1996. I was in college then, right here. Since then, it's become a chasm. If you went to any kind of 4-year college and have a degree, even if it's a not very open enrollment, not prestigious school, but if you just have that 4-year college education, you're more likely to vote one way than another. Now, I'm not saying that one way or the other is right. What I'm trying to say is that it's become heavily politicized, so that you got one half of the country or one side of the country saying that higher education is itself a problem. And just from a human development perspective and economic development, I'm if you view higher education which doesn't mean higher education is flawless, but if you view it as a problem, then you've also probably got a problem with economic productivity and improvements in human well-being, because kind of a lot of things happen at universities that we need. And yet here we are at this moment. So I don't want to make the mistake of saying universities, everything's just fine, move along. But I also don't want to say it's only the university's fault, because a lot of these reasons why education has become so polarized are really embedded in what's happened over the last 30 years, especially the story of inequality. So it's a balanced conversation that we need to have.
Yeah, I would add one more statistic, which is 40 million Americans have some college education but no degree, right. So they carry the loans without any of the benefits.
Exactly.
So, no, thank you for that. So I would also put in perspective sort of the role of higher education in this conversation. Let's sort of just come back to the campus for the moment and sort of say, okay, so for the moment, let's say maybe higher education is not the only place in which to try to foster, right, the ideals of this kind of civic discourse, but it is one place where we might want to think to do that, right? Because to your point, we don't necessarily want to send the message, so as you're saying, that everybody has to have a college degree to sort of live a dignified life. It's entirely possible to live a dignified life without having to go to college. So the university doesn't have to be the only place in which to sort of think about fostering this kind of civic discourse that we think is important, we're saying is important here for society in general. And Rakesh, you sort of laid out sort of the ideals of what we're trying to do here, sort of leaning into it, as it were. And I guess I would just be interested to hear from sort of Brody and Soleil as students, right? Is that the message you're hearing? Is that sort of how you're experiencing sort of the ideals that Rakesh is talking about in this context? Or is it something else that you're experiencing and hearing in the context of the university? Brody.
I need to think about this one a little longer. Soleil, would you like to take it?
Sure. I always speak before I think. So I would say, going along with sort of what you were saying, so when I went to university, I just graduated in May, I never felt so simultaneously alienated and also on the other end of the spectrum with so many people I identified with. They're just it was the most polarizing experience of my life. And I think when I entered into certain spaces, I realized that when people come from different backgrounds and from different sort of microbiomes of information, you're going to learn that there are a lot of people around you that think very differently from you. And you can't make people think the same, but you can teach people how to think in the same way, and that's teaching critical thinking. There are a lot of people you'll encounter who don't know how to critically think. That doesn't mean they're stupid, that doesn't mean they're uneducated, but going to university, I think I learned how to think critically in a way. I thought I was doing it perfectly before. I thought that's what got me to a place like Harvard. But critical thinking requires you to examine your own views under a microscope, take stock of what you believe and what others believe, put those thoughts in conversation, and then form an opinion or a response or an argument. A lot of people don't do that. They don't take the time to do that. They don't see the value of doing that. And
could the university do more to encourage that?
Yeah, I think that teaching critical thinking is perfectly possible, but a lot of universities think that people know how to do that already when they come here. And so they don't necessarily.
No, thank you. And thank you for sharing the part about sort of feeling both alienated at the same time and also sort of as inclusive as well. I think sort of speaks to the idea of the kinds of diversity we're trying to encourage here. Have you had a chance to sort of think this through, Brody, in terms of
I have.
Was this message sort of landing with you? Was it sort of a different kind of message? How did you experience it?
Yes, I very much relate to what you said at the beginning about a sense of finding a lot of commonalities with people, but also a great sense of alienation. I think that is in part by a degree of the culture at Harvard, where I've found so many people that I feel like I relate to at a fundamental level, but so often with all of the things that we're concerned about for the present, for our future. Friends that I thought I could rely on just disappear sometimes. And that isn't a natural consequence of being here, but it's really troublesome and it's decreased my faith in other people in many ways. But I will say that this university has helped me to become, if not explicitly a better critical thinker, at least better about metacognition and thinking about how can I do better in this class. Struggling through, I'm taking Japanese, and I've learned so much in that class, gone from knowing virtually nothing to being conversational at least, and facing challenges early on in that class where almost everybody had some kind of experience in the language and I had nothing, even at the elementary level. It forced me to learn new ways to learn, to go through, read the PowerPoint before class so I know where the class is going. And additionally, I can't help but think of a class on trade policy that I'm taking right now that originally I was pretty much exclusively pro-free trade, but taking this class has really challenged my views about the downsides and significance of it.
But great, but you said it, so it's been helpful in regards to the ideals that Rakesh just laid out, but at the same time, it's not always easy to sort of follow through on those. Is that right? Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. And in terms of the community, I went to a private Christian school in Texas, and well, the culture isn't the same, especially in terms of religiosity. I can't help but find myself falling in with the same people very often. And that's partially my fault of not, I won't say not expanding my horizons. I tried to speak to large groups of people, but Dean Karana, earlier you said human beings like being around people who remind them of their favorite person themselves. And that still happens to me too.
No, thank you very much for those candid responses to the ideals that the university is trying to put forward and how you experience them and ways in which they have maybe actually been realized in certain ways, but also the difficulties in doing so. So thank you very much. So if we can actually do this here, right, that's certainly, I think, Rakesh, to your point, not just in the university, to Sewell's point, if we can do it more broadly, would be very helpful. And I guess that sort of brings me to you, Yael. In other words, we've heard about, throughout our conversation today, about ways in which to try to lean into this issue of diversity, on the one hand feeling both alienated and at the same time sort of feeling a sense of belonging. It seems like what we've been talking about social media is basically everything is the opposite of what we've just been describing here in terms of 150 word limits, active listening, not being there. Is that true, or is there a way in which actually social media could be different in a certain kind of way to try to approximate or maybe foster some of the things that we've been talking about here?
Sure.
And you have 2 minutes.
That's my whole life's work in this last question.
Well, you actually, no, I sorry, you have 150 words.
Oh, thanks. So what I find so interesting about this conversation is it's so rare that you bring these two different perspectives into the same conversation, right? Which is important because they actually feed off each other. The world that social media has helped create affects how students interact with each other on campus. So about 10 years ago, up until 10 years ago, I had spent my whole career focusing on threats abroad. I was, in the national security world, an intel officer, and then a diplomat. And I'd spent so much time focused on things about, building bridges overseas and engaging with communities that were not like-minded. A lot of that was sort of hearts and minds type work. And in 2015, I shifted this whole focus to what was happening here in the US because I actually could see it plain as day, and I'm not saying that I was unique in this, that we were becoming polarized in a way that was more dangerous to us than any threat that I had been countering abroad. And I'm not saying social media is uniquely responsible. Let's be clear. When I was an undergrad in the 90s at UC Davis, I participated in something that had students coming up to me yelling to my face death threats. So I don't want to pretend that none of this existed before social media. However, before social media, I do think in many cases there was more of an impetus to at least somehow engage with people who are not like-minded. And what the world of social media has done is made it easier and easier to both choose your silos, but also be pushed into silos that you're not aware that you're being pushed into. And I will not give the entire attention economy speech right now, but this is the point. It's the personalization. It's the using all your human behavioral data to then turn around and target you with the information that is going to most appeal to your lizard brain. And I love that you talked about critical thinking because this is actually a core component. We led, actually with somebody in this audience, a piece of work with a bunch of neuroscientists exploring how digital technologies affected your cognitive capabilities and what that meant for our ability to communicate. And we came down to critical thinking as the number one thing that was being affected by how we engage online. So what could be done? Well, that's definitely not a 2-minute answer, but it's all about incentive structures. I have tried from every possible angle. I went into Facebook after being one of their number one critics in a very senior role to actually try to address some of these issues. If you know anything about me, I left 6 months later and became what some call one of the first whistleblowers. I don't call myself that. But the point is, it is not the companies, and it's not all social media. Some are created to create community. I'm talking about the biggest ones. They're not going to change their incentive structures out of the goodness of their heart. That is understood at this point. And
Is Section 230 part of the answer?
oh, yes, but that would be a 10-hour speech. That is my life's work.
Okay.
I don't want to put you all to sleep, but yes, modernizing and updating Section 230, which most of you probably don't know what it is one of the keys.
Right. So it's holding media companies responsible for what gets posted on it as opposed to not doing.
So, at its intent, social media companies, one of the reasons they were able to scale to the degree they were, is they were given preemptive immunity.
Yeah, from liability.
From liability for what people post, which, to be clear, on its face makes sense to me. But that got expanded to preemptive immunity for anything, for how your algorithms work, for your own business decisions. So to the exercise we discussed here, and then I'll pause, I'll stop there. I will say legislation and regulation is absolutely necessary. Do I think a social media company is responsible for a student who posts a hateful comment? No. Do I think that social media company is responsible if they then take that comment and somehow amplify it 1 billion times? Possibly. Do I think they're responsible if they then start recommending people who have nothing to do with that conversation to join that conversation or to connect into it, or they somehow start targeting people? And if somebody reports to that company, I have been doxxed on your platform, and they ignore that report, it's a whole question of where does accountability lie? And right now, nowhere in our laws, and that's one of the things we're trying to
I
fix.
guess that's interesting, but we can take at some level accountability for ourselves.
Absolutely,
Right.
And that's the thing. I'm not
So-
saying we are not responsible for any of it.
Exactly, that's right. So I guess that is sort of the last thing, and so I guess in this spirit, I guess the question is, I'll take accountability for ourselves at a certain level. And it's very hard given all the kind of incentive structures that exist out there as well. And I guess if you think about sort of taking that kind of personal accountability, right, I guess I sort of want to sort of wrap up by asking each of you, right, as panelists, what can you do individually to sort of take that kind of accountability as a way to then share out with our audience members? If you don't mind my asking in sort of one sentence each, like what would it mean to sort of take accountability in this kind of context beyond the university, but sort of more generally in trying to create this kind of more engaged and informative and helpful and constructive civic dialogue? So what is one personal thing, Brody, that you might take away with regard to developing that personal accountability, not to put you on the spot as saying you're not taking personal accountability, but as a way to sort of help our audience understand what they also might do, right, in this context, because legislation is hard, the incentives are hard, the business is hard. So what would my thing be?
Think before you speak, and think about how the others respond.
Yeah.
I'm going to cheat and give 2. Push yourself to engage with people who are not like-minded, because the world we are in online right now is not pushing you to do that. But I have to say, do not therefore think it is too hard to create the social media environment we want and to push for the legislation that would help.
But how do you push to find yourself engaging with people who are not like you?
So I have always chosen to work with people who are not exactly like me.
Good.
But it is harder and harder. We have self-selected even into where we live. We have become more and more siloed. You have to push yourself.
So push yourself. So how about you? What would you
Well, my life's work is journalism, so one thing I'd start with is read news. Now, by news, I don't mean turning on cable TV and watching people yell at each other. That's not news. I'm talking about reporting where a journalist has gone out and observed the world, reporting that's based on data and evidence and perspectives.
Right.
And corollary to that, read widely. Don't just read one news source. Mm-hmm. Read sources of information that might challenge or unsettle.
And do you do that, Sewell?
Of course.
Yeah, and how is it? Is it hard to do?
I think it's always hard, actually. It's always hard to feel intellectually uncomfortable. But I also think that place of discomfort or feeling unsettled is actually where intellectual growth and personal growth come from.
Great. Sully, how about you?
My response is very similar. It's just arm yourself with knowledge and let that knowledge be diverse and let that knowledge be uncomfortable. And
So how do you do that for yourself?
I mean, like you were saying, I mean, I don't necessarily engage in a lot of online news that goes against what I believe, but I spend a lot of time talking to people, maybe not in real life, but back and forth in comment sections in 150 characters. I've spent hours talking to people online, and I think that while those conversations can be frustrating and you can feel like you're losing the argument, I have not engaged in any social interaction online where I haven't walked away with a new piece of knowledge in some
So
way.
making yourself uncomfortable. Rakesh, how about you? What's the one thing in terms of personal accountability that you could imagine doing in this context to sort of help advance the ideals we've been talking about?
Well, first of all, I do like the idea of just drop the keyboard and pick up the phone. I would say that I now kind of try to discipline myself that when I find myself disagreeing with somebody, I just assume we're plugged into different algorithms.
And so the assumption then, what does that do for you when you make that assumption?
That I'm also like probably getting a very limited, highly curated source of information that is playing to whatever, my age group, demographic, and, and that this person's probably in a different algorithm. And so we need to now figure out why we're in these different algorithms, and that's interesting, or why we might be actually in the same one.
But you're also, can I just quickly, you're also talking about an act of empathy.
Yeah.
Because sometimes if you hear something that's disagreeable or even offensive, it's very human. In fact, it's the most human thing to be like, what the fuck? But a more considered response might be, how did this person get to the point where they believe or are saying this?
Right.
And one point in journalism is like, it's actually often more revealing and more interesting to ask someone about their experiences than their opinions. They'll share their opinion. But if you start actually with what they've experienced, you might have more insight into how they got that opinion. You may then choose to reject that opinion, but at least you might see how that person got to that viewpoint in the first place.
Okay, good. So I know we're over time, so basically I just want to wrap this up quickly. Right? Civil discourse, right? The ideal of the university is also important, as we've talked about, for society. Without it, Sewell, you're worried that we actually may not exist anymore, right? It's up to the bonobos. And even in a place like the university where it's supposed to be the ideal, as we've heard, it's actually very hard to do that, right? So how can we then even imagine it happening in the context of society writ large, given all the things that Yael has told us about how social media operates? Okay. At the same time, what I hope we've been able to do tonight is provide a microcosm of a model for how we actually might engage in a certain kind of civil discourse, right? Think about ways in which we can all take personal accountability in that face of that there. And yes, it is difficult, right? But I hope you've taken away something from this discussion in ways that you might engage in that. And I want to thank the panelists for this great civil discourse. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil.